community is pretty irreverent to begin with. And I think Turtle's already full of himself. I don't want to give him any more credit. He's a good guy, just in small doses. So, I think his own Furry Fandom is Sarah. He has this like fictional.
Yeah, I think that's it. He was actually one of the first artists I ever saw.
Yeah. He actually shared old zines with me.
Yeah.
It was bizarre. Like most people who talk about how they got into Furry Fandom, they'll be like, "Oh, I had a friend, or I was surfing and I saw this thing and I felt these things." With me, I knew I liked anthropomorphic stuff when I was 12.
Yeah.
And then I got together with this guy who ran a computer message forum. And I never said anything online. He just decided to spontaneously show me photocopies of furry art. We were hanging out at the snow shop. He was like, "Hey, what do you think of this?"
Yeah.
I'm like, "What the hell? I've been looking for this stuff for 7 years."
Exactly.
It's like, "Oh, there's a whole subculture." I'm like, "What?"
Where?
And I'm like, "Crap, I'm going off to college in 2 weeks." So I was immediately cut off from learning about it.
Here, look at this. Melts away.
No, and then I logged into Furry Mug, and that involved deciphering someone's awful handwriting with the net address, figuring out how to use Telnet with no instructions whatsoever, and I'm like a bit of a computer phobe. That was an eye-opening experience. Don't necessarily recommend starting in Furry Fandom that way, but oh well. It is 2 p.m. I'm going to wait just a little bit longer, so in case people want to trickle in.
You want me to hand out your handouts for you?
We'll wait just a bit. I sometimes talk a bit fast and I slur a bit. Are the people at the back able to hear me if I talk like this, or should I project a little bit more? You're good. Okay.
They could move up to the front.
Some people want to like leave their hair filling down. I don't mind. It's like, this is the fill time before closing ceremonies. That's what I'm doing. And I'm at the front of this panel.
Now, is this free too with 4Es?
Hmm?
Is this free with 4Es instead of 3 for your fortune teller?
This is absolutely free. In fact, I lose money with it because I've made handouts. Unfortunately, this is just going to be me blabbing away. I don't have any visuals to go along with this. I probably should. It would actually force this presentation into some sort of organized narrative. There will be pauses where I'm like, okay, wait, I have to check my notes to see if I skipped anything, because these are a mess. I didn't do this panel last year. I thought I'd take a little break from it, so. The hardest thing is sort of like what's happening now in Furry Fandom. It's really hard to tell because we're still in it. You have to kind of compare with what the fandom was like 5 years ago and say, okay, has anything changed? And you really have to think about it because so much of it is natural. Actually, here's a quick question. So hands up, who here came into the fandom like in the last 2 years? Okay, a couple. How many people came into the fandom like in the last 5 years? This one? 10 years ago? Couple? More than 10?
More than 10 for me.
Oh yeah, you're okay, all you people are like, yeah, we'll see what this guy says. There's like old politics, that people just don't let go.
No.
That's why I'm wearing no politics, just fun.
Okay, here's something interesting. How many of you know the name Eric Blumrich? No? One of the Burn Furs?
That's why
Yeah,
I'm
Gary,
they're known by a
spell
different name.
He's not come back into Furry Fandom. He started a computer game project involving, I think, cats living on an island in Maine, and all of the humans have mysteriously disappeared. It's still way in the early programming things. I don't know if he's even ever made a game before. He's working on it with an old Earth artist named Scotty Arsenault. I'm curious. I mean, the guy was kind of an ass, but he was still a damn good artist. And
Several from that movement were...
And Charlotte Trotman, a.k.a. Squee Rat, she has actually become an incredibly successful independent comics Kickstarter and publisher. She's raised like millions of dollars for independent publishing comics, including adult titles. And you're like, really, Charlotte, after all the things you said. So, I wish her well. I even bought one of them. Okay, well, it's just after 3. I don't know if we're going to be getting any more people. So, hello, welcome to History of Furry Fandom. My name is Dronon, and you're about to find out why. I originally got into the fandom, I found out about it around 1991, but I couldn't really get into it until about 1992. I don't have a large social network. I edit a site called, co-edit a furry news site called Flayra.com. There's some posts, I've been leaving some flyers around. If you ever want to like write a review of a con or a book or a movie, computer game, modern, obscure, we're looking for contributors. We have some really kind of nasty flame wars going on right now, but ignore those people. We can clean up your, if you say, well, I'm not the greatest writer, well, just write it anyway. There's me and 1 or 2 other people, we can clean up the text, add images. Anyway, I do have a handout that you can keep, so if you have to leave early. This is sort of a super condensed version of Furry Fandom history. I'm just going to rehydrate myself really fast. I'm originally from Toronto, but now I live in Winnipeg. We just had our first Furry Con. And I usually do a con or 2 a year. And I've never been much of a writer or an artist or anything. And part of the reason why I started doing this panel, my mother is an anthropologist, my father is a sociologist. So when I participated in Furry Fandom, I also sort of looked at it as a social system. And I mean, I am a furry, but I also was sort of intrigued at what furry was. And I just started keeping track of what was going on in the fandom and decided, well, I should try and put together something. Oh, thank you. Something cohesive. I'll be mentioning names of comics and computer BBSs and all that. You don't have to memorize any of this stuff. There's a larger narrative. So what I really want to get across is sort of the flow of how the fandom has evolved. And like I said, I don't have any visuals to go along with this. And I'll probably take questions at the end. I know most of us are probably going to want to go to closing ceremonies. My notes are a little bit disorganized, so just bear with me because I will have to pause and say, okay, have I missed everything? Because each time I do this presentation, I'm like, crap, and I forgot to mention whatever. Oh, yes, please, help yourself. Okay, so it's difficult to talk about the start of Furry Fandom because it's very nebulous. It's like just individual fans just gradually coming together, and it took quite a while to sort of coalesce. And mankind has been interested in anthropomorphic stuff for thousands of years. There's a carved mammoth tusk. It's got like a really weird name I don't know how to pronounce. The Lion Man of the Hordenstein Stadel.
Yeah, you said it right.
And they've dated it to like 40,000 years ago. It's like an anthropomorphic line. So we've been thinking about it for a while. We like take animals, we project aspects of ourselves onto the animals, and we use them as a mirror that we can see ourselves in. But all the different mythologies, all the different cultures, they've all had completely different reasons for doing it. They might want to tell an allegorical or moral tale, and other cultures have just done it for storytelling, because animal stories are fun. Hey, Grandpa, tell us the story about how Coyote, stole all the village's food, and they're just fun. And that, I think, is a continuity that we've had through human civilization. But furry animals, I mean, in the late 60s, you did have stuff like people were writing books, like you had George Orwell's, was it Orwell's Animal Farm?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was Animal Farm. There was a comic called Pogo that was sort of social and political satire. There was a cartoonist named Robert Crumb. He was like underground comics. He was like, let's just offend everyone with sex, drugs, and violence. But he wasn't part of the start of furry fandom. But there was also a lot of animals in advertising, and pretty much every furry was like, you know what? And there was a lot of furry stuff in kids' literature too. So you're a furry, you're watching this stuff maybe on TV cartoons or in children's books, and or fantasy novels, and you just don't want to let it go. To you, it's not kid stuff. You want to bring this into your adulthood with you, but you feel a little bit embarrassed about it. So maybe you don't talk about it much. So how furry fandom really gets started is you're an adult nerd, and you have this obscure interest that you don't even have a name for, and you sort of keep it to yourself. But you're a nerd, you like other things. So if you're lucky enough to live in a large city, can get around, and if you're not a complete introvert, you're going around to where other nerds hang out. So maybe you're going to a comic book store, maybe you're going to a local science fiction convention, because you like these things. But also, in the back of your head, you know that nerds are creative people, and you're like, and there's a very small chance that maybe I'll find something with a werewolf or a dragon or something there. At these places, there's a slightly higher likelihood. So that's what you're kind of keeping an eye out. And then you bump into someone else and you're just having a conversation about something, and it's going from topic to topic. And then someone, so like, what's your, do you like animated films? I like animated films. I'm a huge Disney fan. What's your favorite film? I loved Robin Hood. Me too! And then you begin, that's how those connections start in Furry Fandom. And it is super, super slow. It's just people realizing they have this common interest. And it's the late 70s, and there are sort of two clumps out of all those little separate dots of fans that begin to form. One of those dots is actually here at this con. He's in the art jam room. Is a fellow named Ken Fletcher. Him and another cartoonist named Reed Waller, who was actually guest of honor here a couple of years ago. They decided to start a zine. And a zine is just a homemade publication about almost any topic you like. It's short for fan magazine. So it's very low budget, pages are photocopied or mimeographed. You staple it together, maybe sell it off, or distribute them to friends. And it was and what they put together was a zine called Booty. And it was a very particular kind of zine called an APA, an Artist Publishing Association. And what it is, imagine you subscribe, you know what a magazine is, you have a subscription, like to National Geographic. Now imagine you only have a subscription if you're a contributor. So everyone who contributes to the zine gets a copy, and there might be a limit on how many contributors there are, and there might be rules like, okay, you have to give us $10 a year just to cover postage, and every 2 months you need to give us 2 pages each. So everyone, every 2 months does 2 pages, sends them in to someone, and then they have a night with friends with beers and maybe a film, just putting them all together, stapling them, and then mailing them back out again. And that's how an APA works. So Ken Fletcher and Reed Waller decided to do one called Voodie, and it was specifically for cartoonists who didn't want to do superhero stories or ducks. This is true. I guess there was Howard the Duck. There was an oversaturation of ducks for some reason. But
We're going strong a long time.
But there were a lot of people who liked funny animal comics. So there was and even I think on the front cover it mentioned that of the very first issue of Booty. It had like this sort of weird guys sort of doing like the Vulcan Star Trek fan stuff. So that Booty wasn't strictly furry, but it was very open to funny animal comics, and it did occasionally veer into mature territory. And that was one clump, and the second clump was in California. There's a group of people who started something called the CFO, the Cartoon Fantasy Organization. And this was North America's first anime club. Most people didn't have VCRs yet, for recording stuff off TV, but 1 or 2 people did. They were very expensive, and so there was a lot of tape trading. They'd get anime, absolutely no fan subs. I mean, they'd get them from either Japanese community television in California, or they'd trade them with people in Hawaii who got them from Japan. And some of the people in this anime club also realized, hey, we also like animal cartoons, like Robin Hood and such. So some of the first founders of North American anime fandom are also the first founders of North American furry fandom. In particular, there's 2 fellows named Mark Merlino and Fred Patton. And so this was another clump that formed. And they were also very interested in science fiction. And so now all of these people like who do Voodie and who are in the CFO, they're going to science fiction conventions. And at one of these conventions, they see this painting in the art show of like this cat woman in sort of like space military gear. And they're like, what? Who did this? And they track down the guy, and it's a guy who I think is ex-military, named Steve Galacci. And he's like, oh, you like this kind of thing? Yeah, I've been thinking about animals and like science fictions for years. Actually, I have like a whole story planned out. And they're like, dude, you should do something with that. But now these science fiction conventions become a gathering spot for the sort of proto-furry fandom to sort of just get together and talk about animals in comics, in animation, in anime, science fiction, role-playing games, whatever you like. Oh, yes, please, there's your handout. And this is how the fandom gets started. And where it kind of coalesces into furry fandom itself is around 1984. someone comes up with the term furry. I don't know who. I think it might have been one of Mark Molino's roommates. So at these science fiction conventions, a lot of them on the West Coast, they start having a room party, and they put up little signs on the wall saying, "Hey, come up to room 515 Saturday for the furry party." And the other thing that really sort of helped spur furry fandom, but indirectly, was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original indie comic. The artists behind that had nothing to. They weren't furries. They weren't, but they were very good at marketing, and they got lucky. They hit it big. The franchise is still going today. And if you've ever seen the original indie comic, the Turtles look very different. It's black and white. It's a lot more gritty. But when they took off, I mean, suddenly you had a TV cartoon, you had merchandising with like lunch boxes, and those early comics became really valuable. And people were like, "Dude, you have like early TMNT stuff. Those comics are worth something." And they were like, "Really? Maybe this is an investment opportunity." So a whole bunch of people started going into comic book stores trying to find what the next big thing was going to be. Now, that didn't happen, but people were looking for it. So suddenly, there were a lot more people buying comics, and this is around 1984 through 1987. So there was a demand, but no supply. So supply rose to meet the demand, and it was called the black and white explosion, although you could also call it a glut, where just a whole bunch of people started producing comics like crazy. Hey, I've got issue number 1 of something, could be valuable someday, and it was a great opportunity because lots of people wanted to tell stories, but they didn't have, they weren't like Superman or Batman or DC or Marvel. And what was also neat is now finally people were able to, before it had mostly been superhero comics, and now they were able to tell stories about other things, and because there was all this interest in comics, people were willing to give them a try. Like, "Hey, want to tell us a comic about a guy whose brain is transplanted into a giant concrete body by aliens? Why not? Hey, how about we do a series of short stories about Chicano girls in Los Angeles and like sort of slice of life stuff? Why not?" And there were also independent comics, even from before the explosion, like ElfQuest or Cerebus, that had been doing very well. And this explosion also allowed people to experiment with the superhero genre itself. So The Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, all came out during this period. And the furry artists took advantage of this. So now we started having a lot more furry comics show up. On the adult side, there was Omaha the Cat Dancer. Steve Galacci, the guy that did that painting that the people saw in the science fiction convention, he did a comic called Albedo. And that was sort of space, that was sort of military space science fiction. And actually, issue 2 of that has become extremely valuable on its first printing because that had the first appearance of Usagi Yojimbo, the samurai rabbit, in it. And then there were other comics like Donabar's The Dreamery or Stins, which was like about centaurs living in a valley in Germany. There was Critters that came from Fantagraphics. That was sort of an anthology comic. And also, there were, because comics were getting really popular, the sort of, the 80s were also sort of the Reagan era. There was a lot of kind of people like, "Oh, I don't know if we should be publishing that sort of thing." And there was a comic book store in Chicago where the police busted in trying to find offensive comics. And they seized a whole bunch, one of which was Omaha the Cat Dancer. And people in the comic book industry were like, "Dude, comic book artists can't afford lawyers." So they started something called the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund to help that. So Omaha the Cat Dancer is sort of indirectly responsible for that group happening. And at that point, furry fandom was mostly artists, just sort of scribbling away. The Voodie, that's the APA/zine I mentioned, it ran out of steam for a while, and it just happens. People get busy, or their interests move on. But there was a group of sort of furries there that didn't want to let it die. So they started a new zine called Rowbrazzle, which I think was a funny word from a Mad Magazine comic. And that one was purely furry at that point. And there wasn't much crossover from the Voodie to Rowbrazzle. It was maybe 10–15% of the people sort of carried over. But now this was definitely a furry fan publication, and one of the first. And now I have to look at my notes because I'm losing track of what I'm saying. Yeah. Okay. So now we're into the late 80s, and we've got people publishing furry comics, And if you're a furry fan, you're reading these things, and people would like write letters to the editor at the back and include their address, you know, because people weren't too paranoid then. And you know, if they met, and people loved mentioning other furry comics, so you could actually write a letter to a complete stranger and say, hey, you don't know me, I saw your letter in the back of this comic, and you mentioned this other stuff? What were you talking about? So furry suddenly gets these new people. Like, up to this point, furry has been people who actually create stuff. They either write or they draw. And now with comic books fans, we're beginning to have the start of an economy. People who maybe aren't writing or drawing, but are willing to invest and pay for art or stories or whatnot. And this is really new. We're also beginning to see computer technology improve a lot. Most people are starting to have home computers, and the internet hasn't come into play just yet. But there are things called BBSs, bulletin board systems. And all a BBS is, you set up a computer at home with a message form on it, nothing fancy, and you attach a modem to your computer, so you phone their computer with your computer, check the message board, leave a message, hang up, someone else calls in, and you check back every couple days. So there are a couple of furry BBSs that are beginning to exist. And this is very computer-unfriendly stuff to even figure out how to get this stuff working. So we're also beginning to have a lot of computer nerds coming into early fandom this way. And towards the end of the 80s, there's a con called Baycon, and the furries had a room party there. But this con was sort of more classic science fiction, you know, people who liked reading the books. And since the late 70s, there's now been a lot of crap science fiction because of Star Wars coming in, everyone wanting to imitate Star Wars. So the literary science fiction fans, hello Charles.
Ignore me.
Okay, ignore me! Venture Brothers reference. So, at the science fiction convention, they're now becoming resentful of this intrusion of the furries. Not everyone, just a couple of people.
Some of us.
And they would, but one year it got particularly bad. Some group of people decided to deface the room party posters. So it would say, you know, come to room 515 to the furry party. They scratched out furry and wrote something very rude, which I won't say. Steve Galachi had a table in Dealer's room. He turned his back. Someone left him a really rude note on his table. Someone composed a rather insulting guitar song. That was played in private, but, you know, word gets around. And so the furries were like, yeah, thanks, guys. And they decided, what the heck? You know, we've got a little bit of spare cash. Why don't we try starting our own convention? You know, we've got enough people for a small get-together. And so the first year was sort of an experiment. That was Conference Zero. And that was, I think, in 1989. I think they got 90 people who signed up, but only 65 were able to make it. And they were like, yeah, we can do this. So that was the very first furry convention. Now let's see if I've left anything out in here. Oh yeah, I'm going to be talking about sort of the nature of how the concept of persona evolved. People in the early fandom didn't really have personas. If you were an artist, maybe you had an animal caricature of yourself, like your physical self. Or maybe you had a signature character that was just a character that everyone knew you drew, like in a comic or something. Or if you were a role-playing gamer, like tabletop role-playing, maybe you had a character in a game that you liked playing a lot. But a lot of the games weren't really furry-friendly. I mean, there were things like Bunnies and Burrows or Traveler had various alien species. So if you were into tabletop role-playing games, you basically had to, you know, find a DM who's like, so can I play like a tiger warrior? And they're like, okay, but I'm going to have to penalize you. And so they're like, that's fine, we'll do that. So those were sort of the early vestiges of furry fandom within RPGing. And also Disney was getting back into TV cartoons again. So by the late 80s, you started having DuckTales, Gummy Bears, Chippendales, Rescue Rangers, and all of these things are creating new generations of furries. At least, you know, it doesn't mean if you watch these things you're automatically a furry, but it's sort of planting the seeds in the back of your head, so when you grow up and you still want more, you know, you can find a community for it. So now we move into the 1990s, and now that we're starting to get furry conventions, we start sort of cutting ourselves off from the science fiction community, which is kind of good because you know, our conventions grow. On the other hand, if there's not a lot of cross-pollination, it's like, So the furries are having a convention. What are they doing there? I don't know. You know. The early panels of these conventions, you'll be like, hey, let's have the cat panel, let's have the dog panel, let's have the dragon panel. There's enough of an internal economy within the fandom at this point that a fellow named Ed Zolna starts a mail order service. It's called Ed Zolna's Mailbox Books. And basically, if you have a small zine or a small portfolio of art or a comic, you can like sell him copies, and then he'll resell them and like mail them to you along with the catalog. So he becomes the sort of distribution point for all sorts of people. And furries are producing zines like crazy. I mean, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of titles. The quality varies quite a bit. They usually have limited printings. Probably the best one at the time was called Huzzah. I think the only way you could get into that one was that if you like had actual, if you were an actual published illustrator, like somewhere mainstream. And Raubrazzle, the furry zine, in the early 90s, it's at its peak. It had 50 members. There are over 30 people waiting to get in. An issue of Raubrazzle, you might only get it every 4 months or so. One of them was over 500 pages. They couldn't even bind it together. It was like sort of in 4 stapled bits. Like imagine that you got, you know, you log on to Fur Affinity or something, you know, it's like all the latest posts. So imagine you got that in the mail every 4 months, you know. It's like, and this is the other thing, Furry Fandom was small enough that it was still it was an occasional thing in your life. You couldn't really dedicate a lot of your time to it, but that made it feel kind of special, because it was an indulgence that, oh, something furry showed up, that's great, you know. So even though there was only one convention a year, you know, that felt really great. It felt very tight. Even the computer BBSs, those were beginning to talk to each other. There was a system called FidoNet, and people would basically get their computers to call each other long distance at 2 in the morning when rates were low to just sort of exchange messages back and forth. So communication was really beginning to improve there. We started having one of our first online archives was just an FTP site. There's a group of people who designed a point-and-click adventure game called Inherit the Earth. It's okay, the company got bought out midway, and they said, can you dumb this down for younger kids? And like, so I think it's available on Steam and on Good Old Games. It's okay. I like it. It's cute, but it's a lot of fetch quests.
Yeah, it is.
And now we're beginning to see the internet come in. And again, this is mainly for people who are in information technology. The only people who have access to the internet at the start of the 90s, you're either in the military, you're maybe part of a really large computer company, or you're at a well-connected college or university. And there was a system of message boards, not centrally located. It was actually sort of distributed across the network. It's a bit hard to describe. It was called Usenet news groups. And there were hundreds and hundreds of Usenet news groups on different topics. And there was one called Alt, short for alternative, alt.horror.werewolves. Someone started one to discuss the Albedo comic book, but then they were like, you know what, we just like furry comics in general. And that eventually became a discussion board called alt.fan.furry. And for at least the first 2/3 of the 90s, this was a really nice way that the fandom could communicate with itself. Not everyone was on it, and there wasn't much of a troll culture yet. But Usenet is also where spam first appeared on the internet, and then it was just kind of downhill from there. The fandom started getting large enough in the early 90s that you began to see distinct clumps forming around specific interest groups, like transformation. Someone's started a sort of a group writing message email list called the Transformation Mailing List. There were people who were interested in military stuff. I think macro, micro groups started to sort of appear in the early 90s as well. But the big thing that had effect on furry fandom at this time was a system called Furry Muck, and it's still running today. Muck is an acronym, I don't know what for.
Multi-user chat client, I think.
Okay, yeah, but it's part of a group of sort of online virtual worlds called MUDs, multi-user dungeons or multi-user dimensions. Basically, okay, do you guys know what Second Life is?
Yeah.
Okay, take Second Life and imagine that is purely text-based. And without having to pay anyone money.
So it's kind of like for candy at
Yeah, it's like a text adventure game where like go north. You're in a room, and then there are people in the room, and you can create objects, and you can yeah, and you can build rooms, and you can describe yourself, and it's still online. There's about 150. Yeah, there's about 150 people logged in a good night. A lot of them may just be idling. Yeah, but again, this was mainly computer nerds because it was really hard to find out that this thing existed. And this is where, again, we don't have personas at this point. We have, well, this is my Furry character. And you could see the different writing styles. Like you'd say, look, character name. And it'd be, you see this majestic dragon before you. And it's like, don't tell me how to feel. And other people would just didn't do that. But it was, I wasted years on that system. I mapped it.
I haven't gone that far yet.
That's how I developed carpal tunnel syndrome. And that had a huge effect. Like when Furry really got going, and those people started showing up at Conference, our only furry convention, you could feel there was a generational difference starting to happen. It's like, oh, you're one of those Furry people? Okay, now the problem is, this is also the time, like on computer BBSs and or on Furry or an IRC that was also getting started. It's like, it was pretty crappy to be a nerd back then. It's been getting a lot better since 2000. I mean, high school still sucks. But back then it was a lot worse. And all these computer message boards and the internet, that felt like nerd space. That was our space. It was our personal secret. And it was novel. It's like communicating with a complete stranger long distance over the computer. That felt weird. It felt secret. It felt underground. These weren't people at school. They weren't your relatives. They weren't on your street. And it felt amazing. So now you're getting together at like Conference. Well, how in the world do you know who each other are? You've never met before, except through these aliases on this MMO, text-based MMO. So some people are like, you know what? Okay, you know what my character is. Look, I'll get someone to draw that, and I'll wear it. And any of you that are wearing a con badge, that is a direct descendant of how that got started. Because that was the best way to figure out who all the Furry people were. At Conference. I mean, people have been doing con badge art at science fiction communities and everything years before, but this is when it really hit Furry Fandom. And Furry because it was sort of real-time chat, we also began to see sort of internal jargon and vocabulary building itself. So this is where the word "yiff" first shows up, completely unironically. That's where the wolves versus foxes rivalry, because there were a lot of wolves and a lot of foxes. We also had a death very on in the fandom. There was a cartoonist named Daet Wolfuar, and we also started seeing, and because of that, people were like, hey, we should try and raise a little bit of money. So charity con raising started. Also, Reed Waller's partner, well, what's her name? Kate Wolseley? I forget. Anyway, she'd been having some very difficult medical issues. And so there was also fundraising for that as well. And also, now the fandom, before most people knew each other by their real names, and now we're communicating by our online handles. And now we're really beginning to feel there's like a group of artists and then consumers, there's a bit of a split. But there's still really no clear definition of the fandom. A lot of people still think of the fandom as something physical that you draw or write about. Now, on the East Coast, this is around 1994, there's a science fiction convention in Philadelphia, or that general area, called PhilCon. And it's a science fiction convention that's been running for like 25, 30 years. And it has a dealer's room. And, so there were science fiction dealers there were a couple of furry dealers, there were some anime dealers. And for whatever reason, the configuration changes and the dealer's room shrinks. And they know they don't have enough space for everyone. And when that happens, you have a couple of choices. I mean, you can either run a lottery, you can say, okay, whoever gets their bid into the table first, or they can just pick and choose. I mean, any version doesn't matter. People are going to get pissed off at it. And the PhilCon people decide, well, we are primarily a science fiction convention, so we're going to narrow the number of tables for, the furry and anime people. And there are a lot of science fiction people who also aren't getting tables. And there was a furry party at PhilCon, and they were just fine. Like there was a pool of money that if you needed to get party supplies, the furries were welcome to that. But a couple of people in the furry and anime communities took great offense at the number of tables becoming smaller and smaller. And the con staff didn't mean it personally. I think they thought that, you know what, it's a gathering spot for furries. What they didn't realize was that on the East Coast, it was the gathering spot for furries. So there was a little bit of resentment. I don't think the con really deserved some of the remarks that were made. But one person named Trish Nye, she was the wife of an artist, and she basically, you know what, hey, let's start an East Coast furry convention. So she booked a hotel across the street on very short notice and said, okay, everyone, we're having a furry convention here. And that annoyed some people because, you know, you're also there for PhilCon. Now you have to divide your time between the two buildings. But it showed that there was interest, like on the East Coast, because going to California, that was expensive, and it was like in a suburb of Los Angeles. There was no place to eat nearby. So this is our second furry convention. At the time it was called Furtasticon. It changed locations and venues over the next 3 or 4 years. It eventually became known as Conference East, which was in northern Ohio. It only ran for 2 years. By all accounts, Trish Nye didn't like to, I mean, she had other staff to work with, but she didn't like to delegate very much. And there was some kind of internal revolution within the con staff, so that went down. And a lot of the staff now like, okay, we're going to start our own convention. And that became Anthrocon. Now, Anthrocon was not where it is now. The original Anthrocon was up in Albany, New York, also on Independence Day weekend.
Yes.
So it was difficult to find places that were open to eat. And Kagi wasn't con chair yet, but that's where he was showing up and starting to tell his storytelling sessions. So that was how we got Anthrocon. All those computer BBS, once the internet really hit, this was around 1993 or so, all those computer BBSs just kind of died. And the problem was that search engines really sucked in the early days. So it was very difficult to find things. The internet really wasn't able to handle message boards yet. So a lot of people were using emailing lists to try and organize things locally. And if you wonder why Google has such a stranglehold, it's because when they came around 1997, they were so good right off the gate. They just blew all the other search engines out of the water. And that's why they're the powerful force they are today. Let's see, what else? Early 90s, I mean, there was adult material in the fandom. It was still kind of low-key. There was tons of sort of, you know, tits and ass cheesecake. Like, wah! Like, I actually actively tried to find a furry publication with none in it whatsoever, and I failed. So, let's see, what else happened? We had the comics, I mentioned the black and white explosion. There was an implosion 3 years later. And then the comic book distributors and comic book stores started closing down because they had all this inventory that, you know, no one was making money off these things. It was dead stock. And until finally there was only one major distributor left called Diamond, who were still the major distributor. But a couple of furry publishers kind of soldiered on, like Antarctic Press, which then Radio Comics inherited a lot of their titles, Moo Press. The ones that are still going, like Furlough, Gold Digger, Genus. Is Genus still going? I forget. Anyway, these comics actually go back to the 90s. There was also, because of IT and computers and the internet, there was this sudden surge in information technology. And lots of people were moving to California to work in the industry, so people had money to burn for furry art. And it was hilarious, because when it was still just 1 or 2 conventions, you know, that's where all the furry fans were. So if you were an artist, you knew who your customers were. So you would see stuff in the art show that was deliberately targeted to specific customers. So you're like, okay, that's got a stag in it, so Arlon is going to be bidding on that. That's got an otter in it, so Jerry Case is bidding on that. That's got a zebra, so Lindsay is going to be bidding on that. I mean, there was no shame. And the pieces were getting more and more complex, and like even, I remember one year there was like 2 oil paintings that together sold for like over $1,000. And I was like, wow. Let's see what else happened. we began to see very early online art sites, but scanners were still coming down in price, so things looked kind of grainy. Digital art sales hadn't really started yet because it was nicer to own prints. Like, you go through the dealer's room, and artists will have like a binder with page protectors, and you'll flip through it. Pretty much any furry fan in the mid-90s, everyone had a binder with page protectors and prints that they bought, or photocopied from someone else instead of buying it and supporting the artist like they should have. And if you were an office supply store anywhere near a furry convention, guess what you ran out of real quick? But again, like I was saying, furry fandom was still very occasional. Saturday morning cartoons kind of died out, but now you had specialized TV channels, like Nickelodeon, that were coming in to fill in that gap. And then we move into the second half of the 1990s, and things really start getting interesting now, because now scanners have become very affordable, and we have tons of art sites. The biggest one, it was sort of the Fur Affinity. Fur Affinity didn't exist yet, but at the time there was one called Furnation. That was run by a guy called Nexus. And also there weren't a lot of people sort of hosting web pages. He said, okay, if you're an artist, I will give you a place to host your art. So Furnation was that site. And there were a lot of other sites. There was Tiger Den, VCL, which was basically just, you'd have a folder, you couldn't really comment very much on it. Orlando, Yerf, that was sort of the clean one. And then there were sites that weren't specifically furry, but were furry friendly, like Side 7, Elfwood. At this point now for comics distribution, just Diamond was left. And the web was just taking off like crazy. And now it was starting to become easier to like spend time with other furries in your social life, because it was getting big enough. The late 90s was also massive amounts of drama. Now I mentioned that earlier that furries a group of furries tended to think of the fandom as something you make. I'm organizing an event, I'm drawing a picture, I'm writing a story. But there was a growing sense for some people in the fandom that it was something different, something more, that furry could also represent something internal. Be it spiritual, be it sexual. There really wasn't anything specific about it, but they realized that that sort of physical representation of the fandom wasn't working for them. And a group of the plush crowd basically created a message board that they called alt lifestyle furry. And it wasn't the most neutral term, because at the moment, gay pride was making massive strides in the 1990s. And in the late 90s, lifestyle was the kind of word you used if you were trying to be an open-minded liberal, but were still kind of uncomfortable. Like, do you know, like, Jay and Harry? They're alternative lifestyle people, if you know what I mean. And then a couple years later, that was being used by vegans and people living off the grid, and it ceased to have any meaning whatsoever. So it wasn't the most neutral term, but lots of people were like, yes, now finally I can talk about this stuff, because if they talked about it on alt fan furry, like, furry, I don't care about these comics, I want to talk about what it means to me personally as an individual. They got treated like crap. And this created an artificial schism, because most furry fans have a little bit of both. They like the art, and they might have some personal meaning to it. But for a little time, there was sort of a push away from the two sides. And it was possible to post a message on both message boards simultaneously. At that time, no, you don't do that. And the alt fan furry group was becoming more and more mired in flame wars. And alt lifestyle furry, on the other hand, was very clever, because they had sort of a charter or frequently asked questions, and it had some things in it that really made it a very positive atmosphere. Like they said, well, what is furry lifestyle? And they're like, well, we can't tell you. It's part of the philosophy of this group that a person's lifestyle is whatever you think it is to you personally. And no one's interpretation is any worse or better than anyone else's. So this really leveled the playing field right off the bat. And anyone who was part of alt lifestyle furry in its earliest days speak of it with incredible warmth, that it was such a positive, welcoming atmosphere. Whereas alt fan furry was just degrading into arguments. And as the 90s progressed, people were becoming, and the internet was coming into people's lives, Pride was making all this progress. Well, this also emboldened people in furry fandom to be a lot more open about themselves. And this was making some people uncomfortable, because there were also fetishes being brought up, like zoophilia. And the fandom was not open to that. That got sort of pushed back, like, no. But everything else was kind of fair game. And this was beginning to upset some people, because some people were like, well, if I want to have a career in animation or drawing or something, Furry Fandom was beginning to have a bit of a reputation. And they were like, well, we're worried about behavior and what that reputation is and how it would affect us personally. And so one or two people wrote a manifesto, which in itself is a pretty bad sign, and some really insulting essays. Like, you could see where they were coming from, but they were so obnoxious about it. Like, I'll just read their mission statement. Anthropomorphics fandom is being overrun by sexually dysfunctional, socially stunted, and creatively bankrupt hacks and pervs. This is not how you promote a sense of unity. Because they really wanted to go back to this sort of, Furry Fandom is sort of physical manifestation. And they had valid gripes about behavior. Because, you hear cons and partying is getting, more and more crazy. Conference 8 gets there are a lot of rumors flying around that. Conference 9 was bigger, and actually most of the drama sort of died down, so that was a good thing. And you'd think, and it's hard to describe why the bird furs got any traction at the beginning, but it's because they broke the ice. People have been tiptoeing around the topic of behavior in the fandom. And even though these guys were being assholes, everyone was like, okay, it's out in the open. Guys, let's talk. Can we talk about behavior and the fandom and what it means? And most people in the fandom were okay with clean and adult material. Most people do, like over 80% of the fandom likes both. We can't agree on where to draw the line, or even if the line should exist. And people wanted to have that discussion, but they couldn't, because every time they tried to have a discussion, and this is mainly on the online news groups, either people in the Burn Furs would jump in, or the people who were diametrically opposed to them would jump in. And neither of them wanted to concede anything to the other side. And I'm not kidding, this flame war went on for 3 years. We're talking 1998 through 2001. And then it's sort of like the Trump administration right now. A whole bunch of people came out of the woodwork saying, well, people are being very open about what they don't like, so hey, I hate gay people. And it's like, hang on. And this happened within, the first year of the Burn Fur movement, which was awkward because, there had been at least one con chair who was like, you know what, I kind of agree about behavior, And then when the Burn Furs started getting really toxic, and he seemed to support the Burn Furs, that looked really bad, and it's, so like a couple years, it was like, yeah, I'm sorry I said that. And I don't know what the Burn Furs were thinking. Like, were they thinking that we'd all just like slap our heads and like, oh my God, what was I thinking? Come on, everyone, pick up your torches and pitchforks. But the Burn Furs lost, thank God. But it was annoying because there were behavioral issues, and no one wanted to discuss the fandom anymore, in any way, shape, or form. And what happened is that, like, in the early 2000s, like, if you wanted to complain about someone in the fandom, it's like, you two are getting kind of huggy in the hotel lobby, maybe you should take that somewhere private. They could just turn around and go, you sound like a burned fur. And you'd be like, seriously? Okay, screw you guys, so, and it was hard, and a lot of people didn't even want to interact in this mess, but the fandom was much smaller, and the degrees of separation weren't very far, so even if you wanted nothing to do with this, you knew people who definitely had opinions, and it was very hard to avoid. And I've skipped over things, but there was pushback. People wanted, hey, let's promote something more positive. Let's promote furry peace, and they started a group called Furry Peace, and they included, they talked about, okay, we're going to be inclusive, we want tolerance, we want people to be responsible as well. That some people, along with the gay pride, yeah, I'll express myself in every way I like. We never agreed on that, and we still don't. And honestly, I think that's a good thing, because if we all agreed, I think the fandom would be a lot less boring. No, it would be a lot more boring, sorry. Duh. And a lot of the people who were part of Alt Lifestyle Furry, that message board, they were becoming staff on all the new cons that were popping up. So they were encouraging, they realized, we should encourage behavior, but let's not be obnoxious like the Burn Furs were. Let's just be very polite, just have a good security team, you know, just set down some ground rules. And that worked a hell of a lot better. And that feeling of sort of community and openness and acceptance that you get in the fandom today, that's sort of a result of that very sort of turbulent period in the late 1990s. Let's see, what else do we have? No, I'm skipping all this. Yeah, people would say, you know, open and accepting. That was the big sort of buzzword in the fandom. And one of the other jokes back then were like, by and large, furries are bi and large. I was thin back then. And let's see, by 1998, we've got five furry cons, including the first one outside North America. I think that's when Eurofurence got started. That's when Furcadia showed up. A completely parallel fandom emerges in Japan called Kimono, and that's still going. We started having our first fursuit parades in 1997, and that was partially because there were too many fursuits to really have a masquerade or a costume show. But also, if you were a dealer stuck in the dealer's room, you couldn't go to the costume show. So the parades were partially made to go through the dealer's room so everyone trapped behind their tables would be able to see the costumes. That's why that tradition started. Now, the parades are so long that the artists get pissed off because this is taking 45 minutes to an hour. The larger con is like, you know, we are trying to sell things here. So I guess some cons have been following that tradition without sort of realizing that now it's not so practical. So like Midwest Fur Fest has decided, maybe let's not have a parade. Let's have, you know, group photo shoots. Anthrocon went the other way. They're like, you know, how about we have the parade go outside? Pittsburghians love it, even though, like, July in Pittsburgh is hot and humid. Let's see, what else happens in the late 1990s? A guy named Steve Plunkett starts showing up with puppets. And this is a really late addition to Furry Fandom, which is weird because most of us grew up watching The Muppet Show. And I guess they were so high quality, it just never occurred to us to do it ourselves. So suddenly puppetry starts becoming a thing. At the beginning, it's almost all lip-syncing to songs. It takes a while for actual plots and storylines to emerge. And actually, Eurofurence has been doing like an hour and a half fully scripted puppet show. Tani Darial, you know, our guest of honor here, she actually participates in that. And I did go to Eurofurence once, like in 2006. And damn it, that puppet show made me cry at one point. I'm not afraid to admit it. They killed one of, who are the two magicians? Siegfried and Roy? Yeah, they killed one of their tigers. But he was trying to save the world from evil spirits. The other thing that you're getting throughout the 1990s are waves that happen. Like, there'll be some thing in the media, and suddenly a whole bunch of people will come into the fandom. So Lion King, wave. Gargoyles, wave. Sonic, wave. Balto. Okay, like... oh, and then there was like rave, you know, furry dances start going, and there's a lot of rave culture, and so like the baggy pants. And you just have to wait it out. It's like 3 years of furry artwork with like baggy rave pants. I'm like, please draw something else. Oh yeah. And also in the late 1990s, you know, furry market is still a thing. Maybe not as active as before, but people have Furcadia characters as well now. But now you're not hearing the term fursona yet. People are talking about, this is my personal furry. That was a term you would hear. And you'd also, like, at the end of message board posts on the line, at the end of someone's post would be this whole weird series of symbols and acronyms. You know, like A+++, you know, L minus plus, BMF, whatever. This is called the furry code. And you could look it up online, and this is either a way to describe yourself or your furry character, sort of in acronym form. And then we get into the 2000s. Like I said, people were avoiding talking about problems in the fandom, which didn't make them go away. But also, we unfortunately now had a whole lot of external media writing about the fandom, and it was very much look at the freak species, or like, oh, it's all about fursuits, it's all about sex, so it's all about sex and fursuits. And then they would show up in TV shows, like there was the CSI episode, but before that there was ER, MTV's Sex 2K episode had things, and online troll culture was exploding. There were whole message boards like Portal of Evil, Something Awful, just making fun of people. And furries were such an easy target. And this went on for years. And it was annoying, and it was difficult. And we also didn't really have any central message boards anymore, because alt-fan furry had just degraded into flame wars and no one was using it. Alt-lifestyle furry fell victim to its own kindness. Because remember, they were kind of an anything goes atmosphere? So a couple people started writing really inane role-playing, and that just killed it. So there was no way for the community of furry to talk to itself about itself. And everything about the fandom was now being controlled by trolls or these obnoxious reporters. So conventions got really paranoid about the press. And this is when Uncle Kage became chair of Anthocon. So if you've ever wondered why he seems to have a slightly more anal take on controlling the look and the feel of Anthocon, it's because it was born from this time period. And he went around delivering talks about, guys, this is how you talk to the media, you know, this is how you vet them, this is how you introduce things, this is how you describe things, because he had to, because without that, Anthocon, which he was now financially responsible for, would have crashed and burned. And there are different ways to run conventions. I mean, Midwest Fur Fest is now out past it. There's no one true way to run a convention. Like Anthem Northwest just replaced what was Rainfurs, and it's a clean convention. But now I think there's going to be one called Furvana in the same geographical area. So there's different ways to run these things. And not just, there weren't just trolls outside furry fandom. There was a guy, ex-furry, named Sean Keller. He actually made some of the earliest fursuits. And now he started doing, he like did animation a little bit for Disney and for other projects, but he started doing these insulting Flash animations. He actually published a comic like called Sean Keller's
Horrifying Look
at the Furries. You know, it felt like a stab in the gut. We also started, late 90s, early 2000s was where peer-to-peer file sharing. So torrents didn't exist, but you had things like Napster. People could also file share on IRC. And there was a guy who started scanning and digitizing tons and tons and tons of furry art and people's books. You know, people that were desperately trying to break even on just printing these things. And he was like, here, have them for free. And most people didn't even have hard drives large enough to store all this stuff. And this caused a huge paranoia about art piracy. There'd been one in the early 90s too, but this just kind of made it worse. On the other hand, search engines were now working really well. We were beginning to see message boards finally, so local furry groups could you could find people locally, find out about events. So this was such a wonderful change. Around 2000, in Chicago, there was a science fiction convention named Duck-On. And this became a furry gathering spot because there was a fellow there named Robert King who had started the fursuit mailing list for discussing how to make fursuits. You're also beginning to see the first fursuit track stuff specifically in the late 1990s. They were really taking off. Some people just wanted to talk about wearing them, some people just wanted to talk about construction, and some people wanted to do both. But there were people at the science at Duck-On who, again, like BigCon, didn't really like the furries very much. And the furries were kind of safe because Robert King was married to the woman who had started the convention. But they were also, when they were trying to find guests of honor, they were like, well, we've kind of heard about this furry thing, and I don't know if we want to go to your convention. And the furries could only get the main stage at midnight, stupid times. So tensions were building, and so Robert King was like, you know what, let's do the smart thing, let's split off and make our own convention. And that is how Midwest Fur Fest got started. And then Duck-On's membership plummeted. I don't even know if it's still running, but it certainly, it did not do very well after that sort of exodus. It was political, but sort of in a positive way. So by 2000, you have about 9 cons. You've got Poppets, Fursuits taking off, Megaplex showed up in Florida. Now you're beginning to see the word fursona popping up. And a lot more people are doing digital work because, programs like Photoshop and drawing, Wacom tablets, these are now available. You're also beginning to, more people are owning digital cameras, so you're seeing more fursuit photos from cons online. And charity auctions are really taking off because we do well. There was a little period during the burned fur period where a couple cons were doing pet or slave auctions. and everything was couched in the most innocent of terms. But you know the sellers, you know the buyers, and someone's like, you know, you're one phone call away from getting in serious trouble with some of this innuendo. So most cons abandon that. Now that's why we do charity fundraising, pretty much with like donated objects and art and things like that. And because we had more fursuiters, we saw the earliest headless lounges. Funny little thing, there was a furry con in Quebec, because I'm from Canada. It's not running anymore, just the people just couldn't run it anymore, nothing bad happened. And because it was in Quebec, they wanted everything labeled in English and French. And I was really curious to know what they would call the headless lounge. And it was brilliant, because it fit the theme of the con's first year, which was ninjas versus pirates. And they called the room La Salle des Décapités, the room of the beheaded, which was brilliant. You also had more waves. It was like Pokemon's wave, Digimon wave. And right now, like, large companies like Nintendo and Disney, they're still very protective of their public properties. While, you know, My Little Pony and other franchises are pretty lax. Back then, and all throughout the 90s, the fans and the franchises did not have that relationship yet. The corporations did not trust the fan base and really wanted to protect their properties. So it was always a little bit iffy posting fan stuff online. And especially when Pokemon and Digimon came on, people were like, guys, if I'm attacked, I don't have lawyers, I don't want my website to go down. So furries got around this. Well, I will draw stuff in the style of Pokemon and Digimon. No, this isn't a Pokemon or Digimon character. No, this is my Pokemorph, or my Digimorph. And also in the early 2000s, again, our economy just kept growing. So now we had furry auction sites showing up, like Furbid, Furbuy, Second Life came in, YouTube came in. The Ursa Major Awards were created to sort of try and draw attention to things that people wouldn't yet notice. Around 2005, that's when Kyle Gold's books, like digital printing, like print-on-demand services, started taking off. And this was amazing. Webcomics took off, because now you didn't have to work through a diamond distributor for a paper copy. No, now you could publish comics online. And if it worked really well, you could sell Dead Tree versions. And this was a huge boon. And for a while, there was something called the Web Cartoonist Choice Awards. And for a couple of years, they actually had a Best Anthropomorphic comic category. Let's see. Yeah, then Furfinny showed up. So what happened, like a lot of the, like, remember I rattled off a huge list of art sites, like Furnation and Yerf and Orlando and VCL. Well, all of those were kind of wobbling along. Either they were getting there was a lot of internet lag, or the administrators just weren't putting in the work, or they still work, it's just they didn't have any features that were particularly useful. It's like, well, here's my art, you couldn't comment or favorite or anything like that. And then there were a couple of sites that weren't furry specific but furry friendly, like there was one called Yaoi Gallery and another one called Cheesy Art, and they changed their rules of submission. Either they banned adult content, or like, well, we want to move away from furry content, so furries are like, where do we post our art? It's like, what is there? So Fur Affinity was cobbled together kind of very quickly under different people. It wasn't Dragoneer yet. I don't think.
The person who started it goes to the sky.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and that's why Fur Affinity was and still is such a huge thing, because it was pretty much the only place to go. They just, by default, got everything. And it's just been kind of wobbling forward ever since. It's really surprising that IMVU bought Fur Affinity a couple of years ago. That is, it's the first time that an external commercial entity has invested really significantly in furry fandom. Let's see, what else happened? Yeah, okay, so by the time we get to 2009, actually I'm doing really good for time here. We have what, it's until 4:30, right? Yeah, okay.
Or a little before that so we can get down to closing.
Yeah. Okay, so around 2009, we've now got 30 cons all over the world. Most of them are small. There's only 10 with over 500 people. So 2009, Anthrocon has about 3,700 people. And now being a geek or a nerd is okay. Like I said, high school still sucks, but you know, what can you do? So now here we are. I should also talk a little bit about the evolution of art shows. Like I mentioned, specifically for a while, you'd have artists custom making pictures in the art show for certain customers. when there were still very few conventions, it was great for shopping. And then once you had about 10 conventions or so, artists would start saving their better work for the big three, which at the time were Further Confusion in California, Midwest Fur Fest, and Anthicon. Further Confusion was also born out of a bit of drama with Conference going down and Further Confusion Rising. That's a bit complicated. I'm going to just skip over that. But in California, sort of the closest con that approximates Conference is Califer, although it emerged much later. So now here we are in 2009 and onwards, and again, it's a bit difficult to tell what's happening because we're still in it. Surprisingly, troll culture has helped us in that we've gotten numb to people being obnoxious on the internet. Like I said in the early 2000s, you couldn't really complain to furries about other furries because people just didn't want to hear it. Now that trolls are really obnoxious and we're kind of used to people complaining about stuff, if you show up in Furry Fandom and you just make a very intelligent observation about something that needs to be improved, and if you don't sound like a complete asshole, people are like, you know what? Maybe you have a point. So that's sort of an indirect effect of the trolls. We can talk to ourselves about ourselves again. Because we honestly we could not do that in the early 2000s. It sounds strange. And a lot of people coming into the fandom are getting very mixed signals. Like, on one part, we tell people, be open, be true to yourself, express your identity. And then on the other hand, we say, and you might not want to be too public about it because people online are kind of assholes. So we have this sort of weird Jekyll and Hyde thing going on there. Now, 95% of fans have personas. Hybrids have just shot up the list because there's so many foxes and wolves and dragons. Now you've got species being meshed together, huge, bright, vibrant colors. Our art sites that we do have, now they're huge and they're very difficult to maintain. I don't care what your opinion of Dragoneer is. I feel sorry for anyone trying to maintain an art site. Just the amount of money and hassle and drama that it takes. So now it's hard to even start a new one. I mean, now we have Weasel and Ink Bunny, Furry Network, and a couple of message boards. Let's see, what else is there? Again, we don't really have a central message forum in Furry Fandom. We haven't since the 1990s. We're still very local in how we tend to discuss things. Tons of anthropomorphic web comics. There's a lot of CGI animated films that have just been great that have been coming out in the last couple of years. Trolling is not as bad as it used to be. And the newspaper articles, we still get asshole reporters writing stuff. But a lot of them are like, hey, there's some weird people in town, and they're having fun. That's been going since about 2009. That is so refreshing. Vice magazine has been really positive about that.
You also saw how much money Pittsburgh is making.
Oh yeah, like millions of dollars. And there's also better relations between fandoms. Like there's crossover stuff like Klingons and furries bowling competitions. Someone a couple years ago tried a steampunk anime furry convention. They only did it 1 year.
It didn't last more than 1 year.
No, I heard it was sort of like oil and water and other oil and water. Yeah, so cosplay, like that, people understand that now. Our demographics have shifted. Like we've been getting gradually younger and younger. Like as of last year, about 40% of the fandom, 40 to 50% of the fandom is like under 20 years old. 45% of the fandom is sort of in their 20s, and then there's gray muzzles like me. I don't know, I stick around, why not? And also, like in the late 90s, like remember I said there were a lot of sort of gay and bisexual furries showing up. That's because if you were like gay and a science fiction fan, what was out there for you? I mean, there was Xena Warrior Princess on TV that kind of had a oh yay lesbian subtext going on. But really there wasn't much out there, and furry was like, this is open to interpretation. So that's, I think, why Furry Fandom got so many LGBT. And now we're seeing a lot of the T, because again, we're considered a safe space. So it's just the same pattern repeating itself. There's been a group of social scientists and sociologists and social psychologists who've actually been researching Furry Fandom. They call themselves Fur Science. They have been publishing articles, some of them a bit scholarly. And they've also been doing surveys at the major conventions. Now there is a bias to their data. It's like people who attend conventions and are over 18 years old. But there's been some really interesting data coming out of them. Our conventions have gotten big enough that now we have panels called So This Is Your First FurryCon. Dance competitions, I mean, we didn't have that back in the day. That's about the last 10 years or so. That's new. The larger conventions are beginning to provide sign language interpreters. And if you take all the furry conventions from about 2010 onwards, we've raised over $2 million collectively. And we're still small. You know, like Gen Con is like, what, 60,000 people. Dragon Con is like 80,000. And this is now just sort of a random list of things that are sort of going on and off in the fandom. Your character here, that's a recent development. That only popped up in the fandom about 7 years ago or so, in terms of commissioning. And it's great. It's a great solution. It like gets rid of like, okay, I have an idea for my character, but you like move the arm, you do this. It's like, stop making changes. So now it's the artist who says, okay, I already know what I'm going to draw. Now I'm having an auction to get your character into my drawing. And that just gets rid of that whole problem. It's brilliant. You know, we had the 2014 chlorine incident at Midwest Fur Fest. We've had conventions go down with Rainforest and Oklahoma and Rocky Mountain FurCon. You know, we've had the alt-right stuff happening. It's been getting increasingly difficult to book hotel rooms. It's like buying concert tickets, except you just want to go to a furry convention. We had the My Little Pony Friendship is Magic wave hit fandom, and that was hilarious, because if you had been in the fandom in the 90s, like I mentioned, all those waves coming in, we've been through that. And then, for some reason, I don't know, there just weren't any waves for like 10 years or so. And then My Little Pony happened, and everyone like freaks out, and they're like, ah! And if you're in the fandom, he's like, guys, you just sit it out. You know, that's all you can do. Yeah, like, so we've got more print-on-demand stuff. Crowdfunding has been a huge boon to furry fandom. Just, hey guys, I have a project, I just need the money, what do you think? Podcasting has been taking off. Video production has been getting better and better. Just the quality. YouTube has been an amazing forum for people to just post stuff. Furry fandom is large enough that some cities, furries will book nightclubs once a month or so, just to have get-togethers. And social media has been amazing for us to be able to communicate. And really, that's where we are. That's where we are now. And I guess what I can say is, you know what? In furry fandom, just be positive, be active. You know, spread news. Like I said, we don't have a way of communicating with each other. So if you see something you like, just advertise it. Just mention it on social media or wherever you communicate. Because the only way we can easily find out about stuff is for information to kind of go sideways. You know, do outreach if you can. And then what really matters is just to have fun with itself. If anyone came in here late, I do have a handout, which is like a condensed version of this. It's got some links at the end to some online furry resources. It's 4:11, so closing ceremonies is just under 20 minutes. If you want, I can take questions or observations. Please give me feedback. I mean, if you have a different opinion, I want to hear it. If you do have a question like, so what's your opinion on this or that? I don't want this to be a soapbox opportunity, but yes.
Is there anywhere online or like in person to read like the old zines and stuff?
No, unfortunately not. Mark Rolino and his partner Rod O'Reilly, who ran the original Conference conventions, they have started putting old things online, like bits of old zines, room party flyers, bits of old comic books. I don't know if they have any full zines. I know there's an online blog, like someone, Amar, Furry Times. He's been buying a couple of old furry zines, not the greatest ones. It's sort of like whatever's available on eBay or whatever, and he's been sort of scanning them and putting them, not many. It's hard to find. It's very hard to find them. And there were dozens and dozens and dozens of them. The artwork was kind of so-so.
I know, but it's still like really interesting.
Yeah.
Cool to see where it came
See
from.
if Ken scanned some of his old stuff.
He did. He had a box here a couple years back. I was able to flip through some things. And there were some that were outside Furry Fandom. Like there's one called Centaurs Gather Room that was just for people who like drawing centaurs, and there was a bit of crossover with Furry Fandom in that. So. Yeah.
You were kind of saying too, you know, things have gotten better about sort of public perception, and I do wonder too if, you know, I think generally things have moved to being more accepting of weird stuff,
Oh yeah.
nerd stuff, especially. But I do wonder if the MLP stuff didn't help furry somewhat too, because that got a lot of media attention and a lot of comments and a lot of hate.
Funny story about the start of brony culture. Okay, so there's an online website called Cartoon Brew. It's basically a blog about the animation industry, largely in North America, but they also try and look out for foreign films as well. It's very artsy-fartsy. The main editor is a guy named Amid Adichie or something, and they posted some stuff that was very controversial. Like there was collusion among several animation studios in North America to keep wages down and not pay people enough, and he broke that news. But he's also written these very fiery essays, I think just to get people arguing about some topic or another. Anyway, and this is an interesting site because it's followed by both industry people and fans, so you get a very interesting mix of people commenting on it. There are lots of industry people lurking. They will never post, but they are reading the site. So when My Little Pony Friendship is Magic first came out, he wrote this ridiculous over-the-top essay. That's like, oh, another franchise cartoon. Look at this artwork. Oh, this is like the death knell of anime. It was a ridiculous article. And it was so over the top that 4chan took notice of it. And they wanted to mock it. Now the problem is, you can't mock it without being able to compare what it's talking about. So the 4chan people had to go and watch My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, so they could make fun of this article. But in watching My Little Pony, some of the 4chan people, well, their heart grew 2 sizes that day. And they discovered this wonderful, happy thing inside of themselves. So this whole website devoted to being obnoxious suddenly had all these happy people loving ponies. And this is how brony culture really took off. It was hilarious. But it has definitely helped.
Yeah.
Interestingly,
and I was just kind of, you know, thinking about like the relationships between too, because like anime, you know, kind of hates on furries sometimes, but I think that's getting better.
oh,
and, like,
it's never been too much of a rivalry, to be honest.
No, but you can find it at
yeah.
anime conventions even now.
The people who did the social study research, they've also interviewed outside Furry Fandom as well, because they need to compare groups. Yeah. And they said that they weren't too sure if My Little Pony is bringing people into Furry Fandom. It's just that a lot of furry fans ended up just also liking My Little Pony, and they said that about 20% of furries at the time also liked My Little Pony, and about 20% of bronies also liked Furry Fandom. So there was a bit of crossover like that.
Yeah, I definitely crossed it.
No, any other questions, comments? Yes. Oh, you've got old issues.
You're.
Oh my God. Okay, this is a late '80s, early '90s zine. It was one of the more. It had more literary content that you would get. It had the occasional pinup, but you also had stories. Watts Martin, who recently published the book Kismet, some of his earliest work appeared in this. There was an ongoing military SF called Empires. That was in there. And also, flip open to the inside back page.
You know, I should look. I might have some of those at home.
Okay. No, the inside back cover. Somewhere around there, okay, this is artwork. Oh well, bad choice. Somewhere in your, they had the list of the old computer BBS bulletin boards. That was like how you could track down some of these spaces. They would like show up in here. I don't know if anyone wants to take a quick flip through, like in the last 10 minutes. Just here you can get an example of what an old furry zine felt like. This one was a lot higher quality than most. Thank you for bringing those. That's amazing.
I should dig and see if I can. I'm sure I've got.
I used to have a whole ton of them, and then I was clearing house, and I like put all these things in a box and sent it to Anthicon, and they just sold it off all massed together for like $42. And I was like, dude, whoever got that box got old Black Sad comics. They got like 20 copies of Yarp and Fang Claw and Steel. It's like, and now I regret that because now I'm doing these panels. It's like, shit, I don't have any visuals.
So if I do this panel, I should bring some of my own stuff.
Yeah, well, like I said, I might eventually make a slideshow. That will sort of force me into a very specific narrative. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed History of Furry Fandom. I'm sure I've forgotten stuff, because I always do. Yeah, so just explore the fandom, have fun with it, and no idea where it's heading, but there's only one way to find out.
Along for the ride.
So to the future. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you've had a wonderful time.
I'm almost sure I got a year for something called.
Actually, someone republished some collections.
Silver Gato Man, he bought me a coffee. Silver Gato Man, here is the song for thee. He likes to video all the panels at the cons. You should go and watch them whether they are short or long. Silver Gato Man, you video that's not a jibe. All of you go to his YouTube channel and like and subscribe.